Hello and welcome everyone in the room and everyone online to this session, Can the Law Save Sea Ice? The Case for a 10-Year Moratorium to Protect our Sea Ice. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Inga Relf, Executive Director and co-founder of Global Choices. Inga has a corporate background and is known for strategic insight and bold policy innovation around global systems change to achieve the environmental and social development goals. Her current focus is on climate, governance, and security policy, and the need for multilateral action to protect the global commons. She was a senior policy advisor to the Elders, a group that included senior leaders, including President Carter, Mary Robinson, and Kofi Annan, and during the landmark SDG and COP21 negotiations, and as advisor to the Vatican, the Commonwealth, and several governments. Working internationally to improve the social and political status of women, she has trained peace negotiators and supported women through the conflicts in Iraq, in Yemen, Egypt, Syria, Libya, and Somalia. And back in the UK, she helped establish Gender Action for Peace and Security, GAPS UK, a collaborative peace-building organisations holding the government to account for UN commitments. Inga is a board member of the Responsible Finance and Investment Foundation and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Justice lies at the heart of her environmental activism, not only because it's the greatest existential threat facing us all, but the poorest and the marginalised are inevitably the worst affected. She is recognised as one of the 100 international women of spirit, and she believes real change can come from a change in consciousness and that there is no other. So we're really excited to have her here today, and I welcome Inga up.
Well, thank you for that, and welcome to all of you and to those who are joining us online. I know there's some who've got up very early to join us, so and thank you, congratulations for being expeditionists and making your way here. I think, and you may also sort of wonder when you looked at the sign what's Uganda got to do with things, and actually, interestingly enough, in our theory of change, Uganda's got a lot to do with it, and we'll explain a little bit later why that is. So we have with us today an absolutely stellar panel. We couldn't want for better, and it's a really interesting and diverse panel, and genuinely intergenerational, and as you can see, very gender balanced. So, and you're not the token woman. So because we're going to be a bit tight on time because there's so much of interest to say, can the law save the Arctic ice? And the question is a very important one because it's something that we are losing at such a pace that for sure to be going through another process of treaty negotiations like the BBNJ, which was wonderful, but it took 18 years, the ice will have gone. So when Sally Rani and I, my co-founder, set up Global Choices, we thought, okay, we're going to do things differently. And one of the things that we realized was a huge opportunity was to leverage the law to protect critical spaces. The second piece was also to reframe the Arctic, which has been wonderfully governed as, when it was all frozen, and nobody really cared, and it was the province of the scientists and the province of explorers. And but now, of course, it's a very, very different story. And science has clearly shown the correlate between the loss of the Arctic ice and the impacts on globally, but particularly on small island states, CARICOM, and any of the coastal regions. So our theory of change is that this needs to be seen as a global commons. And we're talking about the Central Arctic Ocean, which is an area beyond national jurisdiction. And we do need to bring in the voices of those most affected into how this space is protected, because it's actually they who are going to be most affected. So that's the essence of why we also are talking about this today. So the answer to that question is yes and no, and this wonderful panel will explain why that should be the case. So first up, let me introduce Professor Michael Meredith. He's the science leader of the British Antarctic Survey, and he's president of the Challenger Society for Marine Science. He's a professional fellow in oceanography at the Murray Edwards College at the University of Cambridge, which is where we met. And he's also the science leader, sorry, I've said that already, is head of the Polar Oceans team at BAS, with British Antarctic Survey, which has done some amazing research and actually has driven a lot of this polar conversation for many, many years. He's also a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, and he was the lead author, coordinating author of the IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. In 2018, he was awarded the Tinker Muse Prize for Science and Policy in Antarctica. And it's a huge recognition of the contribution he has made to understanding of the Southern Ocean and also its global impacts. So we found in him the Southern partner. And we quite often joke because we show the world, from the Arctic perspective, and he shows it from the other side, and it's still the same world. So he really is a remarkable authority on this. So we're going to enjoy very much, Michael, having you explain to us and contextualize what we're trying to do in a global system, because this is how we have to think. There is one ocean, one Earth, and all these very important global governing systems. So the podium is yours, sir.
I'm quite embarrassed now. I didn't realise that I was quite as good as you say I am. I'm actually probably not, but thank you anyway. I doubt that very much, but thank you. So anyway, this is who I am. It's a great pleasure to be here at this wonderful event. So thank you very much for inviting me. And what I'm going to try and do is give some context and background for the framing of the discussions that will follow on from here. This is a figure that I show quite often when I'm giving presentations, and it really just emphasizes the point that Inga just made, is that we talk about the oceans. In reality, there is only one ocean. And this projection is the one that I like very much for emphasizing that point. It's called a Spillhouse projection. And what it shows is the ocean surrounded by land, as opposed to a conventional map where you have the land surrounded by ocean. And what you can see in this projection, of course, is that all the different ocean basins actually interconnect. It's one single system, just with lots of different components to it. And that really matters. That matters for an awful lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that it's the ocean that connects our planet across all the scales of interest. And of course, the thing that does that is ocean circulation. The ocean isn't static. It moves around, it flows, it transforms, it moves heat, it moves carbon, it moves oxygen, it moves nutrients, it moves all the things that are essential for life all the way around the world, makes them available in different ways, in different places. One of the reasons this plot is so powerful, I believe, is you can see how important the polar regions are to this global connectivity. The Antarctic leaps out at you. Or it would do if the pointer would work. It's not showing on the screen. Never mind. The Antarctic leaps out at you because it's in the middle, and you can see all these arrows change color. They circulate around. These are transitions happening around Antarctica that are critical to sustaining this overturning circulation in the world. But if you look up at the Arctic, it seems small by comparison, but there's some very critical transformations happen in the Arctic as well. Where these arrows change color, this is water that's being reprocessed, it's being transformed, it's changing. And by doing that, it's completing this overturning circulation. Now, I mentioned heat and I mentioned carbon because these are two of the things that are most critical to planetary climate. We know that the ocean is doing a huge amount of good work by absorbing heat from the atmosphere, absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. In fact, more than 90% of the heat from global warming has gone into the ocean. If you look at where that happens, the polar regions do more than their fair share of work in that regard. The Southern Ocean around Antarctica draws down a huge amount of heat. The Arctic also punches above its weight in terms of drawing down heat from the atmosphere, storing it at depth. And that's heat that if it stayed in the atmosphere, it could go into the land surface, it could affect people, it could affect livelihoods all around the world. And it's the same story with carbon. The ocean absorbs a vast amount of carbon. It locks it in the deep ocean. And by doing that, it slows the greenhouse effect and it moderates, it helps buffer climate change globally. And again, the Southern Ocean does a huge amount of work, and the Arctic punches above its weight in that context. So the ocean is doing us a huge climate favor by absorbing all this heat and all this carbon. And you can even put numbers on these. A calculation you can do just for fun. How much is the Southern Ocean carbon sink worth if you had to buy it as a climate service separately? Fun calculation, you get a number of about 70 billion euros per year. And that isn't money you can just take and spend. But if you wanted to buy that service in a different way, that's the money you would have to find each and every year. And that's just the Southern Ocean. I've converted it here into UAE currency as well, just for fun, because it's an even bigger number, which somehow seems fantastic. So the ocean's doing us a huge favor, but this favor isn't for free. This favor comes at a very large cost. And that cost is the changes that are happening to the ocean, especially in the polar regions. So the ocean is heating up. The ocean is losing oxygen. The ocean is acidifying. Sea levels are rising. In the polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic are both losing ice. The Arctic has been losing ice at a dramatic rate for many years now. It's very well established. Around Antarctica, the ice seemed to be holding on until about 2015, 2016. And since then, it's been a story of very, very rapid decline. So unfortunately, both poles of the ice is hugely under threat. This matters for all sorts of reasons. I mentioned the ocean is heating up. The plot at the bottom here is a recent plot from WMO, and it shows about extremes of ocean temperature, marine heat waves, what they called. WMO classifies these, and the blacks here are the most extreme. They're the most damaging marine heat waves. And you can see in 2023, the Arctic hugely affected by these extreme, intense marine heat waves, also around Antarctica. And this is actually quite surprising because for a number of years, it was thought that the Southern Ocean would be relatively spared the worst excesses of these marine heat waves. And reality is playing out differently to that. So both polar regions hugely threatened by ocean temperature rises as well as ice loss. Now, this matters globally. We said the polar regions are changing. We said it's part of a connected system, and this is very much the case. But these arrows, the schematic of ocean circulation, they aren't stable. This circulation is changing on global scales. It's hard to say exactly how in some instances, but for example, in the Atlantic, the pattern of currents, the overturning circulation, is thought to be slowing over the course of several decades or longer. The actual observational time series we have are quite short, so it's hard to prove it with exact data. But over those longer timescales, there's evidence that the circulation is slowing. The plot on the right-hand side here shows the supply of dense water from Antarctica into that Atlantic circulation. And you can see over the course of a few decades, that's dwindling. This is drying up over time. And that has impacts on how much heat the ocean can absorb and how much carbon the ocean can absorb. So it's a bit of a concerning story, the way these things are pointing. And of course, the elephant in the room, the point I've been trying to make, all of these things are connected. None of these things on the planet are independent. The Arctic is changing, the Antarctic is changing, the Atlantic circulation is changing, but everything else is connected as well. So if we change these circulation patterns and we change where the heat and the carbon and the nutrients are moved to around the world, then anything in the planet could be affected. And some of the things as shown here could be affected quite rapidly and quite dramatically. This is a plot I've updated. I've included Antarctic sea ice on this plot myself because when it was first published, it wasn't there. But you see our Arctic sea ice is there, Antarctic sea ice changes, every bit as concerning now as the Arctic sea ice changes. So the take-home messages, the thing I'd really like you to take away from this short talk, ocean circulation connects across planetary scales and it matters for our climate and the existence of life on our planet. Changes in the Arctic and the Antarctic are threats to the whole planet because of that. And these changes will occur more in future. They're not going to stop. One thing we know is that the Arctic and the Antarctic are more vulnerable to changes from climate change than other regions in the world. And so the changes that happen there to the ice and to the oceans can be extreme, and they will have effects that ripple across the whole planet. So the final point, the vulnerability of the polar regions to climate change are urgent drivers for action in their own right, but also because of the global impacts that they have. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I probably have some wonderful. Well, I think there's a very strong message there, isn't there, about just how more than anywhere the poles are being affected. And I think the big aha moment for me was the realization that this is a whole system going extinct. And we hope that this will be a realization that will also occur to this group of people. And please do take some of these postcards with you when you go, and hand them out. We've got plenty more. We want to get this message out because it is a system that is going extinct. An entire system is going extinct. And the big moment for me was that it's unlikely that it's recoverable, not in our lifetimes anyway. And that is very, very serious when we see all these consequences. So to continue the story, but from a northern perspective, I'd like to welcome Heidi Silvestre, who's also one of our newest Global Choices advisors, and we're very delighted to have you as on our advisory board. She is a glaciologist, a fellow international of the Explorers Club, and she's working at AMAP and the AMAP. I always hate these acronyms, don't you? The Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And it's a working group to the Arctic Council, which has been a really, really important group driving knowledge and science and understanding. And we have also many of us come from both the Arctic Circle Assembly, but also from the Paris Summit, where I have to say the news was pretty dire. So, Heidi, I don't know if you've got any good news to share, but come and tell us what it looks like from your side.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. I'm really honored to be with you this morning. So thank you very much for the invitation. As you said, I work for AMAP, which is kind of a nano IPCC in the Arctic. And I'm bringing you some of the latest news when it comes to why we should care about the Central Arctic Ocean. Why should we even care about the sea ice up north? And why should we deeply care about what's happening to the Greenland ice sheet? So before moving to my slides, which are mostly focusing on Greenland, I'd love to tell you about the sea ice up north in the Arctic. I'm really lucky to be able to spend many months of the year high up north on the archipelago of Svalbard. And this place has the northernmost town in the world, the northernmost university in the world. We're at 78 degrees north. And what is taking place there is simply terrifying. So Svalbard and the seas around it has become the fastest warming place on Earth. It's warming 6 to 7 times faster than the rest of the world. And our daily lives depend upon the presence of sea ice. And believe me, this year, I've never seen anything like it. Sea ice simply wasn't forming. The ocean was too warm. For many, many months, we were waiting for that sea ice to come. And what we had instead was one storm after another, after another. I've never seen such scary conditions. It was impossible for us to do any field work, to take our students out. It made our lives miserable. And when you see over there the consequences of the lack of Arctic sea ice, you understand, you truly understand that if sea ice disappears, it will make our lives absolutely miserable. So the reason why we care so deeply about sea ice in the Arctic is because sea ice is amazing. I mean, sea ice is a white expanse of ice. It reflects solar radiation back into space for free. I mean, it gets rid of a big part of the heat we get from the sun. And the problem is, it seems that we're trying anything we can to exterminate this sea ice. The latest studies have shown us that we could see some days, some weeks, some months during the summer in the Arctic without any sea ice left as early as the beginning of the 2030s. So that's in 7 years. In 7 years, we might see the month of September in the Arctic without any sea ice. So this is not only terrible for the ecosystems in the Arctic. I mean, we've learned, how precious and how fragile these ecosystems are. It's also terrible for the 7 million people living in the Arctic. Let's not forget the indigenous communities. Let's not forget the local communities there who need the sea ice to, for transportation reasons, to hunt, to fish. They really need the sea ice there. But it also matters deeply for everyone else on Earth. We know that if Arctic sea ice disappears, the consequences over the Northern Hemisphere will be absolutely terrible, especially when it comes to extreme weather events. If you think we've had quite a bad run of extreme weather events over the past few months, well, just wait a few years and see what will happen. If we lose the sea ice in the Arctic, it will be our national security, it will be our agriculture, our economies that will absolutely crumble because of these extreme weather events. And it's so very difficult to prepare for extreme weather events because they're so hard to forecast. And you can ask Robbie Mallet, who's just behind here, who's an absolute expert on sea ice and who's just come back from Antarctica. So we really need this sea ice. And if we don't have the sea ice, the ocean will be very good at absorbing all that heat from the sun. And again, we'll get more extreme weather events in lower latitudes. But also we're starting to understand that if sea ice disappears, the ocean is going to get warmer. And of course, some of the big ice sheets we have in the world, like the ice sheet of Greenland, will start to also melt a little bit faster. I don't know, Amy, if you can try to play the video. I cannot apparently with the clicker. But this is just a very quick video, a representation of the melting of the Greenland ice sheets. Oh, maybe the video wasn't downloaded, was it? No, but it's very simple. It's just from GRACE satellites telling us where Greenland is melting, and it's basically melting a lot around the periphery. And what we're seeing is that Greenland loses about 270 billions of tons of ice into the ocean every year, and this number is steadily increasing. So the more sea ice melts, the more the ocean is getting warmer, the faster Greenland loses its ice. And I don't know if you realize simply how much ice there is in the Greenland ice sheet. So there is enough ice to increase sea levels globally by 6 to 7 meters. So that's what, 22, 23 feet. And this matters enormously because today, just between 0 and 1 meter of elevation on the coastlines, we have about 230 million people. Between 0 and 10 meters of elevation, we have about 1 billion people. And again, as we know, it is the most vulnerable countries that are facing sea level rise from Greenland. But it is also, I believe, 8 billion people who should care about sea level rise from Greenland, because it is about populations being displaced. It's about crucial infrastructures that will have to be moved, whether it's airports, harbors, agricultural areas that will have to be displaced because of sea level rise. And so I have a series of maps. This is what I showed yesterday. I visited the Dubai British School. So I was speaking to all these youngsters. They were amazing, but I showed them something that was a little bit terrifying, is the sea level rise we might have here in Dubai because of what's happening in the central Arctic Ocean. So this is a meter of sea level rise, and what you would know if you had read the State of Cryosphere report from the ICCI organization that is organizing this pavilion here. We can totally get 1 meter of sea level rise as early as 2070. So this is right around the corner. This is certainly coming. So all the areas that will show in blue are areas that will be underwater. We could totally have more than 1 meter of sea level rise before the end of the century, because it seems that we're trying so hard to melt Greenland as fast as we can. So this is 2 meters of sea level rise here in Dubai. And we could also get absolutely up to 3 meters of sea level rise as early as the beginning of the next century. So this is absolutely what we're facing if we do not regulate fossil fuels. If we do not try to phase out these fossil fuels, this is what our future will look like. And this is why here in Dubai is actually a great place to talk about the Central Arctic Ocean, because the Central Arctic Ocean is right here on the coastlines of Dubai. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. Thank you.
There's another one after that, isn't there?
Oh yes, just a book
Yeah.
for underwater.
Yeah. Yeah, and we laugh, but it ain't so funny, is it really, when you think about it? So thank you, Heidi. That was really very clear. It's also very clear, this graph, I think, that what we have to do is cut emissions, and we have to do it fast. This is no longer optional. There's this direct correlate between the loss of the ice and emissions. You know, 1 ton of carbon equals 3 square meters of ice loss. So that, if we start thinking about that, and I hate to say this, I calculated what it cost me to get from London to here. And if we did that for 70,000 people here, we might just see quite what we're doing. So who better to explain to us why we need to have a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty than Zefra Berman. Now, Zefra, you will have seen in the news recently quite a lot, but is a very dynamic woman who has really, and let me just give you her formal bio, but has been a real inspiration to all of us, because unless we couple emissions with ice loss, we're not going to get anywhere. So, Zefra, I'm just trying to, find the right bio here. You have been doing advocacy campaigns for over 30 years, haven't you? And yeah, quite. But that's where the real value add comes, because you have seen what moves people and what doesn't motivate people, and that's why I think this wisdom of all of that experience of your campaign being brought into this at this critical time is really making huge change. I mean, people are really hearing it. For 6 years, you were the executive director of the Tar Sands Network Strategy, another very, very important campaign. And you have held positions advising the British Columbia government and the Alberta, co-chairing the Alberta government and co-chairing the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group. And you hold an honorary doctorate from the University of BC, and you were adjunct professor at York University for 5 years. In 2019, you were awarded the Climate Breakthrough Award, which was $2 million to develop a bold new global climate strategy. And boy, haven't you just used that well. So we will hand over to you to encourage us all to lobby for no more fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, to support this project and Global Choices, and second of all, to learn from all of you. This has been a great morning already. For 30 years, our governments have been designing climate policy and laws, meeting to create international agreements. And during that time, we continued to set emissions reduction goals and targets, and every year we missed them. During that time, in some ways almost behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has been dramatically increasing fossil fuel production. When I first started doing this work in Canada in the oil sands, I was told, but fossil fuel production isn't a climate issue. Emissions are a climate issue. We're only responsible for emissions, not for production. But what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. Climate policy and international agreements and climate science is complicated. But what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions from carbon that are trapped in our atmosphere today that are causing the sea ice loss, that are causing the extreme and lethal heat, that are causing the extreme weather around the planet, 86% come from three products, three things: oil, gas, and coal. Yet the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words oil, gas, and coal. In fact, the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the word fossil fuels. Because the fossil fuel industry had a strategy, and that strategy was to make their products invisible, to confuse, to deny, to delay, to deny the science, to delay and weaken climate policy and negotiations to such an extent that we can be here 28 COPs later, still debating whether to include the words phase out fossil fuels. Right now, the strategy of the industry is to include words like abated and unabated. They'll commit to phasing out unabated fossil fuels, leaving the hope that they can decouple emissions from production, plan more fossil fuel projects, and then put in place some technology to reduce emissions. But studies this year from the IEA, from the ITCC, from the ETC just 2 days ago, from the IPCC, a lot of different acronyms. Every single study has shown that what those companies are good at capturing is not carbon, it's our governments. So where do we go from here? The fact is that we need agreements to constrain the production of fossil fuels and not just emissions. By creating laws and policies that reduce demand for fossil fuels and emissions, it's like we're cutting with one half of the scissors. We need to cut demand and supply. And in fact, if you look at other intransigent issues throughout history, other treaties, you see that we did that. We cut demand and supply, tobacco, CFCs, and many others. So how do we cut the supply of fossil fuels, and do we have enough? Right now, we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal between now and 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. That's data from the new United Nations Environment Programme Production Gap Report that only came out last month. Problem is, the same statistics that came out 2 years ago in the Production Gap Report that governments ignored, and the 2 years prior to that. So we're going to hear governments here talking about a tripling of renewables, which we need, and increases in energy efficiency, which we need. But we need that energy efficiency and renewables to displace fossil fuels. The atmosphere doesn't care if we create renewables. The atmosphere cares if we create less fossil fuel emissions. 10 years ago, 80% of the energy that we used on this planet came from fossil fuels. Yet during the last 10 years, we've had a dramatic drop in the price of renewable energy. We've had an incredible uptake in renewable energy. Renewable energy is being built at scale all over the world. Today, 80% of the energy we use on this planet is from fossil fuels. So why is that? It's because every country and every company knows we have to use less, but they all want to be the last barrel sold. So they're producing more and more fossil fuels and infrastructure, and they're creating more and more demand for their products. In fact, a couple of days ago, there was a report released that Saudi Arabia, a scandalous report, that Saudi Arabia had a special strategy to get people in Africa more hooked on fossil fuels. We can use less. We have enough on the surface of the planet or under construction already that if we burned it, it would take us past 2 degrees. We have enough to use during the transition. Renewables are cheaper now at scale. So how do we ensure that our governments do that? We started the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative because we need 2 things. We need to work together. We need to have one call to governments all over the world. And we need those governments to cooperate. Together, we are stronger than we are apart. One simple demand: stop the expansion of fossil fuels. Cooperate together to phase it out in a way that is fair and equitable. and put all of that money, the $1 trillion in planned oil and gas projects between now and 2030, put it into renewables. The $13 million a minute in fossil fuel subsidies that the IMF says is going from our governments to the industry, put it into renewables. We need to fast track solutions. The Fossil Fuel Treaty calls for international cooperation, new global rules of governance to create financial support for countries that right now are drilling for oil, for example, Ecuador in the heart of the Amazon, just to feed their debt. If we are going to have a just transition, first of all, it needs to be a transition, and that means stopping expansion. Second of all, it needs to be a global transition, and that means countries have to cooperate to create new rules and new mechanisms to ensure that they support each other in stopping the expansion and winding down, and it means wealthy countries have to start first. And right now, just 10 countries, the wealthiest countries on the world, plan the majority of fossil fuel expansion between now and 2030. In fact, the majority of oil and gas expansion is coming from one country, the United States. So the good news. The good news is that since we proposed this initiative, it has been endorsed by over 3,000 scientists, 101 Nobel laureates, 100 cities from around the world, from Calcutta to Vancouver to Rome, have passed motions at their city councils endorsing the initiative. We have faith groups, health groups, women's groups, indigenous groups all over the world signing up and running their own campaigns. Now we think in about 40 countries. The website's been translated into 16 languages, not by us. And here at COP, 3 more countries have called for a negotiating mandate to negotiate a fossil fuel treaty. A year ago, I stood at COP27 and we had one country, one brave country, Vanuatu, who had proposed the fossil fuel treaty on the floor of the UN General Assembly. Today, we have 11, including Colombia and Timor-Leste, both fossil fuel producing nations who know they can't stop producing unless we have international cooperation. So join us. Join us in the call for the fossil fuel treaty in whatever way you can. Because if we don't stop the expansion of fossil fuels, we will lose more lives. This year, 7 million people lost their lives just due to the air pollution of fossil fuels alone. 5 million alone from lethal heat. Every ton of carbon matters, and we have to stop making the problem worse. And we need to focus together on solutions for building the world that we want. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you. If ever you wanted an illustration of dynamism and how we are going to change the world, and how we don't have to rely on governments solely, and how new initiatives can coalesce and work in partnership with a new type of energy, how couldn't ask for anyone better and a better example. So thank you. And we do use you as a role model, I have to tell you. You know that. And we're very grateful. So
Yes, hello, I'm Chief Gary Harrison, I'm from Alaska, and I agree with you. And I think that there is also a problem with many of the developing countries, even Saudi Arabia. A lot of people don't know that Saudi Arabia has a lot of debt. But one of the reasons why they produce so much oil and gas is because they need to pay their debt. So that's one of the problems that all of us are facing, is how are we going to do this transition and understand what some of these countries are going through as well. You know, you look at Venezuela. A lot of people don't realize these people have a lot of debt to the World Bank, not just the World Bank, but the IMF and the other ones. So it's a problem that we normally don't even think about, but it is something that we need to understand as well. If we're going to have a just transition, we need to figure out how these other countries can do it without fossil fuel. I myself am not for the Willow project that the United States just approved up in the Arctic. We've been fighting against 102 area in the Arctic as well. And I think that one of the ways for us to have fuel in the Arctic is with hydrogen. Hydrogen is one of the most prolific elements we have on this earth. And a lot of people are scared of hydrogen, but it's not as dangerous as gasoline.
Yeah, there are. I mean, thank you. It's a very, very good point. And there are some really interesting technologies arising that will give us hope, because we do need hope in all of this. If I may continue, because we're a little bit against the time here, I would like to introduce Osprey Oro Lake, another very dear friend, and a very good friend of Global Choices over the years. Osprey is the founder and the executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WECAN. She works nationally and internationally with grassroots, as well as Indigenous and business leaders, and a really good model for how to bring bottom up and top down and bring those dialogues, which is really what we have to do. And also the other point that you were making, Zephyr, was about collaboration. We're not going to do this alone. And we have to bring unconventional mixes of people together to get a new conversation going, which is what we're all committed to doing. She's also co-chair of the International Advocacy for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Did I get that right? And the visionary behind the International Women's Earth and Climate Summit, which brought together 100 women leaders from around the world to draft and implement a women's climate action agenda. She teaches international climate trainings and directs WECAN's advocacy work in areas such as women in forests, rights of nature, and the UN Forum. And she has served on the board of Praxis Peace Institute and on the steering committee of the UN Women's Major Group on Rio Plus 20 agenda for the Earth Summit. She has numerous awards, as do all of our panelists, I think, including the National Women's History Project here honoree, Taking the Lead to Save Our Planet, Women of the Year Outstanding Achievement Award from the California Federation of Business and Professional Women. And she's also an author of the award-winning book, Uprisings for the Earth, Reconnecting Culture with Nature. And particularly important in all of this legal side of things is where the trends are. And we're certainly seeing some very interesting trends on the rights of nature. And who better to tell us about that? But Osprey, thank you. And also, Osprey, if you would also cover the Indigenous wisdom and the role of women, because I think those are, yeah, in 2 minutes. That's all. Not a lot, but I know you can do it. So thank you very much, Osprey.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Yeah, I'm Osprey Oro Lake with the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and I'm also honored to be on the steering committee of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it's really an honor to be here with you, Zipporah, and also just seeing the incredible momentum that has happened at this COP from last year around the treaty is very, very exciting. And I want to kind of actually link the treaty with my comments around rights of nature, because what I see right now, and the speakers before me have laid it out so powerfully and poignantly, the level of crisis that we're in, starting from the Arctic ice and what that means for all of us, and the actual emergency that nature is in right now. And we being a part of nature means we are in a crisis and an emergency. And the fact that we're up against this fossil fuel industry, which has really co-opted our governments. And we're really in a struggle now for our very lives because of this industry. And this is why we keep demanding a fossil fuel phase out, and why we must take on the fossil fuel industry directly. And governments need to be engaged, and the grassroots needs to keep pushing as hard as we can. But in this moment of crisis, where we're literally looking at places going underwater, people starving, people living in drought, people who are already suffering tremendously from climate chaos everywhere. And I also want to acknowledge Casey Camp Hornick, who's on our delegation, and the Ponca Nation, where she comes from. The fossil fuel industry has already been killing people. We don't even have to wait for any more climate crisis. If you are an Indigenous person, a Black person, a brown person, you're often in a sacrifice zone where fossil fuels have already been killing your communities through cancer and asthma for decades. So we're at this moment of crisis, And what I'm excited about is that things are crumbling and cracking. And that also gives us an opportunity for things like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, because some answers are going to come through this moment of crisis. Likewise, we have been working for years in many different ways on the rights of nature. And I'm on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, or GARN. And this is what we call a form of earth jurisprudence, which is basically a philosophy of law. And I think this is an incredible moment to also look upstream a little bit. How did we get into these multiple crises, or as some scholars are now calling it, a polycrisis? It's social, it's ecological, it's racial, it's gender justice, it's all of these different things coming together. And we need some kind of framework that can really hold the depth of the crisis we're in, so that we can have a very different relationship with nature and with each other. And rights of nature is a framework that I think can be quite encompassing and very complementary to the Fossil Fuel Treaty, complementary to Indigenous rights, complementary to really understanding feminist economics, and these new ways of being that we all know we must bring forward. So in terms of a legal strategy, which is what I was asked to talk about around the Arctic ice, is that we're looking at partnering with Global Choices around what would it look like to have rights of nature be a way of governing not only the Arctic, but also the Antarctic. We've launched a campaign earlier this week on the Antarctic, because these are really a global commons. And how are we going to govern these spaces that affect all of us, all of our lives? And rights of nature is, I can't explain it all in just a few moments, but in brief, it is a completely new DNA of understanding our legal frameworks. So right now, when we look at nature, nature is seen in our legal systems as property. And right then and there, we have a tragic problem, because nature cannot represent itself in a court of law. So when we give rights to nature, we actually have a way of having the oceans, the rivers, the mountains, or in this case, the Arctic, be represented, nature itself being represented in courts of law. And we must have a way to do this. In other words, we have, through the United Nations, established the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And not that it gets upheld, but it exists. It is an agreed upon international declaration, as we have the Universal Declaration on Indigenous Rights. We are calling for there to be a universal declaration on the rights of nature, on the rights of Mother Earth, to get Mother Earth into the center of the conversations with countries. And so I think this is a really key, transformative way of thinking about how we are going to move out of this poly crisis, because it also deals with how people are living on the land with each other as well as nature. And I wanted just to share that this is also not just fantastical. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to bring rights of nature into their constitution. And there have been several legal cases, one protecting a river, protecting forests, using rights of nature legislation. Across the United States, we have won over 36 cases stopping fossil fuel extraction, stopping mining, stopping different harmful projects, using rights of nature in local ordinances. We have in the Ponca Nation, which made history as the first tribe in the United States to recognize rights of nature to protect their territory from fossil fuel extraction. New Zealand Parliament has given the Wanganui River personhood. So now there's different terminology for rights of nature, one of them being personhood. So Indigenous people of New Zealand said, we have always recognized the Wanganui River as our ancestor, our living ancestor. And they fought for over 100 years to get the government of New Zealand to recognize the personhood of the Wanganui River. And now that river is protected as if it's a person, because indeed, for many Indigenous peoples, this is a view, this is a living relative. And so I could go on and on. The Colombian Supreme Court has recognized rights of nature of the Amazon River ecosystem. So this is an idea whose time has come, and this movement is growing hugely. The UN Secretary General recently stated that Earth jurisprudence, and rights of nature being a key component of it, is the largest environmental movement growing in the world right now. So this is not some small fantasy idea. This is actually an idea that governments and local groups and different organizations are picking up rapidly because we understand that we need a fundamentally different approach to how we're living with nature. And I'll just close my comments by saying that there are a lot of legal scholars involved. The Global Alliance for Rights of Nature has many different working groups, academics, attorneys, advocates, indigenous peoples. That is an entire ecosystem of how we're going to actually grow this movement even more than it is. And I think that it's really important to recognize that though it is a new form of earth jurisprudence, the leadership really comes from, and the deep philosophy and concepts comes from indigenous peoples who have for millennium shared with us that the earth is alive, that we are a part of nature. And we have completely failed to listen to the original instructions of our own ancestral backgrounds and from indigenous people who have been saying as loud and clear as they can that we must listen to the river, the forest, the mountains, the land for our instructions of how to live here in a good way with the earth. And so it is also not only a system of how do we live with the nature in a good way, but also completely change our economic frameworks, completely change how we are negotiating in spaces like COP, where we can really put Mother Earth and nature in the center, where nature is who is really the great governor, not us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osprey. I think it is one of, it's quite hard in this space to find hope. But I think this is one of the really hopeful things that we're seeing, is that there is this unlearning and a recovery of this understanding that the problems we're in come essentially from a separation from self, a separation from one another, and separation from Earth. And, the legal system has really exacerbated that by making it so objectifying everything rather than understanding the whole. And this is where also the indigenous wisdom and the feminine wisdom comes in, which is about understanding the whole. And then comes how do we operate, which is with a generosity of spirit that sets self-interest aside for the common good. And these are the things that we are trying to model, and all these organizations are trying to model. And I really do believe that this creates breakthrough. So down to a little more specifics is one of the things that we wanted to do is incorporate all of this when we were looking at a moratorium on protecting the central Arctic Ocean ice, a 10-year moratorium, because we reckoned it's fine. It's a bit like saying we'll plant trees, but we'll cut down the Amazon. And there's all this wonderful high tech. And I remember listening to a whole day of geoengineering, and I was thinking, hold on a sec, why don't we just protect what we've got for as long as we possibly can? Which is why, as Global Choices, we are calling for this 10-year moratorium. And we're saying a 10-year moratorium because we feel that it needs to be a proportionate principle pause. And we had a young legal team working with legal experts over the summer, putting together a draft for this. And I'm very, very glad to have two of our, we call Arctic Angels, here with us. As Global Choices, we are very intergenerational. We have a network of young women climate leaders that we mentor and who mentor us. And we are now 65 of them in 37 countries. And, it's just proof the pudding is here. I'm sure you will understand once you've heard these two speak. So as I say, over the summer, Anna Belinsky and Beth, I'm going to speak to both of you. I'll introduce you both together, actually, because that's probably makes sense. Have been working with these legal experts and being mentored by legal experts all around the world. Now, Anna is a law student, and if I could find my specifics on you, Anna, but I know you have been absolutely passionate about climate since a very young age. And one of the things that you've been particularly passionate about is actually waste and, total circularity and the impact that waste has on the earth too. She has also been working as a Mend It Monday pop-up volunteers who mend clothes for free to address the intersection and illustrate fast fashion and local poverty. And she's also served as the sustainability chair for her university student body and works in her campus office. But she's most passionate though about human-nature relationships and the intersectional environmentalism as a social justice movement. And this is what we are finding from the next generation: is it social justice is the lingua franca, frankly. They absolutely see the importance of equity. And I think that is also one of the big trends that's going to drive change. She's conducted research in Peru on rural Amazonian perspectives of deforestation and received her degree from Gonzaga University. And she has done environmental law and social studies and sociology. And I must say, in these couple of months, it's been an absolute joy because they're bringing such fresh perspectives and prodding us oldies to think differently. And Beth is also an Arctic Angel. She's a climate advocate from Dublin, and she's been involved in climate activism since 2019, bringing very much as an organizer, both as school strikes and then nationally and internationally. You've got more and more involved on bringing in a national strategy in Ireland for education for sustainable development. And you have also worked on improving equitable access to public transport across Ireland, which resulted in a 50% reduction of fares for young people. So, proof of the pudding. Beth is currently studying law in Cambridge, and she has coordinated already in her 2-year process a special thematic report on the link between climate crisis and children's rights in Ireland. And she has presented this report to the UN on the rights of the child. And she has worked for the British Antarctic Survey in between doing this work for us, and is working closely with us as her role as Vice President of the Cambridge Climate Society, and empowering young students. And I had the privilege of coming up to talk to some of the students. And again, just be inspired by these young voices. So I'm going to hand over to both of you to explain why we're having a call for this moratorium and how we think we can make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the intro, Inga. Thank you everyone for being here. So Beth and I are going to sort of do tandem on our bit of the presentation here to talk about the 10-year moratorium that Global Choices is advocating for. And we've heard a little bit today about the science behind why this is such a critical area, the the new movements with rights of nature and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in addition to the ecocide movement that is not on this board, but closely intertwined with all the work that everyone is doing here. And I wanted to introduce the 10-year moratorium that Beth will talk a bit more about. But I wanted to give a little bit of a stake of where we're at right now in the legal field right now, and why it is that we need this moratorium as a separate entity, and what's lacking at the moment in international environmental law addressing the health of the marine ecosystem. So we have, of course, the UN Convention and the Law of the Sea, and that's a wonderful, wonderful agreement that's been in operation for decades now. But it only briefly mentions that the areas beyond national jurisdiction are the common heritage of humankind, and that we need to protect the marine environment. But it stops there. And we have in recent years some really wonderful developments with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, and the Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or the BBNJ, as we all fondly know it. But each of these is powerful in their own right, but does not quite address the Arctic to the extent that we need. The Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was the document that came out of COP15 last year under the CBD, calls for a 30% conservation of domestic lands and water by 2030, and with an ultimate goal of living in harmony with nature by 2050. And that's wonderful and has created some wonderful movements, but it's focused on domestic and within state boundaries, conservation of nature. And furthermore, I know that there's a lot of critique, especially from Indigenous communities, about a lack of recognition that humans can live in a symbiotic relationship with nature, and we don't have to be removed from that. And so Beth will talk more about how that is part of the approach with the moratorium, in that it's a temporary, it's a precautionary temporary approach, so we can get our feet under us before we wholesale remove human activity from an area. Now, we also have the agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. This was passed in 2021, and it is also a wonderful, the fisheries agreement is also how it's referred to. And it is an agreement to pursue commercial fishing only pursuant to conservation measures. It's a wonderful document that we're using as a guidance in our moratorium, as it's a precautionary approach focused directly on the Central Arctic Ocean. However, it's narrow in scope to commercial fishing. And so the work that it's done is wonderful, but it doesn't necessarily, it does not address oil and gas, deep sea mining, transpolar shipping, and the rest of the list that we have there on the slide. And so we need to work beyond that. Okay, and then finally we have the BBNJ, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, has not yet been ratified. But even still, it seeks conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is focusing on, right, the Central Arctic Ocean is the high seas, and that's wonderful, but it's not specific to the needs, the unique needs that this panel has touched on, that the Arctic and the Antarctic, but the Arctic in this case faces, because it's particularly vulnerable. And so we need to have something, some document that is legally binding, that does specifically address the unique needs of this ecosystem. And so we are standing on the backs of giants as we move forward in this, and we also want to acknowledge the work that we're excited to see coming in tandem with our work on the moratorium. So this is the traction that Ecocide is getting as the unlawful and wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either long-term or widespread damage to the environment caused by those acts. And recently, the EU actually has agreed on language for a text to criminalize acts similar to Ecocide just in the last month. And additionally, in the last month, we had the Nordic Council pass a resolution recommending work toward an Ecocide law. And we have those in tandem with the movements that we're seeing with rights of nature that Osprey just spoke to domestically, that both tribes and their sovereign nations are pushing independently, and municipalities around the globe are pushing, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So these are all movements that are coming up in conjunction with the current legal framework that we're wanting to work with, and yet all of these are not quite specific enough to the needs of the Central Arctic Ocean. And so that's what our moratorium is really seeking to address. And so with that, I will turn over to Beth to talk a little bit more about the moratorium itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you all. So essentially, I mean, we've established everything to do with the Arctic and kind of the legal framework that we're operating within, and how essential the Arctic is. And I will just try and get my notes up because technology has decided to malfunction every day this week, as I'm sure you can all relate to, because it just never works when you want it to, does it? Because my iPad's just turned off. Anna, could you pass me my phone? Thank you.
You're trying so hard to not do it.
We were in our room last night and I was like, I'm not going to read my phone, Anna. I'm going to be professional and charge up my iPad. And God had other plans. So yes, So essentially what we really want to finish this off with is establishing why this moratorium is so crucial and why we really have faith in it as a really key solution for protecting the Arctic. And so we've established how critical the Arctic is as essentially the air conditioning of the world's ecosystem and how it links to almost every other aspect of our oceans, of our ecosystems, and the global environment as a whole. And so really the key message of global choices and of this moratorium is that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, right? We need to, as a global community, come together and have protective measures for it. And we need to be aware of how our systems interact with each other and that nothing in nature is in isolation from anything else. And so essentially, as Anna said, this moratorium is a 10-year pause on industrial exploitative activity in the Central Arctic Ocean. And what's really important about that is that the Central Arctic Ocean is the area beyond national jurisdiction. It is not an area recognized as part of any state within the international law order. And so essentially what we're proposing is a precautionary approach, a precautionary pause to allow us to better evaluate this potentially harmful activity, to give time for the ice to heal, and to give time for science and solutions to develop so we can have a longer term approach to this issue and to protecting the ice far into the future as a global community. We want to have caution, pausing and review before we leap, for example, into new shipping routes. We're seeing that we might have ice-free summers eventually, and that is going to potentially open up transpolar shipping routes. And we know that this might involve ice-breaking ships, it will involve pollution. We know that there are risks associated with this. And so essentially we're saying, maybe we shouldn't just leap into this. Maybe we should take a pause. Maybe we should reconsider and evaluate everything that is going on at the minute. And so this pairs with mitigation as well, because we know that this moratorium isn't the sole solution. Even if we stop ice breaking in the Arctic, we're still emitting emissions into the air. We are still warming the atmosphere. And so this pairs with mitigation and these other efforts that Anna spoke about as well. But the really key message is that we need urgent action. We need to have this time as a global community to come together and negotiate a treaty, further agreements, scientific solutions to protect the Arctic. And we're putting this forward because we know that these activities can and will cause damage. Oil and gas drilling in the Arctic, apart from all of the issues caused by drilling for oil and gas in general, leads to cleanup, accidents, and is dangerous for Arctic communities living on the front lines. Icebreakers break the ice, and when that ice heals, it is never the same. We cannot go back. So we're saying, instead of looking at this delicate ecosystem that influences all of us and thinking, how can we maximize it for short-term economic gain? We should think about protecting it for the future and for now as well. And so essentially, this is an argument for the prioritization of long-term sustainability over short-term economic gain. And I think that's essentially what lots of these solutions are. It's standing up against the ideas and the rationales that we have had for decades that have allowed us to drill for oil and gas because of the bottom line, rather than the long-term sustainability and livability of our planet and our communities. It's not enough for us just to think about the next financial quarter. We need to think 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the line. And that is what this moratorium is for. Global Choices always says, and it was a line that really appealed to me when I first joined, that we can't plant ice. There's no coming back from this. When we lose the ice, it's not coming back. When we lose this delicate ecosystem, it's gone. And the companies that want to pursue oil and gas drilling, seismic testing, nuclear activity in this delicate ecosystem that we all rely on, don't seem to realize that. Or if they do, they don't care, which is possibly more likely. And so when we look at the concept of climate justice, the moratorium is really key. Climate justice, as I'm sure most of us are aware, is this idea of distributing benefits and burdens equitably and not imposing unfair and undue burdens on those least responsible for the crisis, and instead focusing on those who are most responsible. And the idea that a small group of companies can plunder this ecosystem for short-term economic gain is utterly antithetical to the entire idea of climate justice and what all of us are fighting for. We also want to emphasize the importance of respecting Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in the Arctic, because these are the people who have been the custodians of the Arctic for millennia. And we recognize that Indigenous knowledge is central to how we manage and protect the Arctic to support sustainable uses of it and its resources. The issues we're facing and the idea that companies can plunder the oil and gas in the Arctic and destroy this ecosystem is inherently rooted in colonialist beliefs, and the climate crisis itself is the result of colonialism. And that is why we're saying we need to challenge these ideas, take a step back. We know that humans can live in harmony with nature, but not the way that these companies and countries wish to do so. by taking these resources and getting as much as they can while they still can. This is a temporary pause, as we've said, and as such, we're not assuming that there is no point in the future in which humanity cannot operate in the Central Arctic Ocean. But these activities that we cover, oil and gas drilling, deep sea mining, transpolar shipping with massive icebreakers, seismic surveys, and nuclear activity, simply cannot be sustainable in this delicate region. And so we really truly believe that this is future fit. Amidst this growing movement of using the law to protect the Central Arctic Ocean, amidst this growing recognition that our legal systems simply are not working, that they are not prioritizing the interests that we need to see on the table, we need to future fit our plans, and we need to take a step back and protect the Arctic long term. We need international cooperation. We need leaders who are brave enough to say that our short-term economic gain is not more important than preserving this ecosystem and preserving the systems that all of us depend upon. This moratorium is a recognition of the need to act with urgency, to act with integrity, and to act to protect what we cannot get back. We hope that all of you will join us in supporting it. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Anna, for that. And yes, it is about making things future fit. I don't know if many of you know the Miss Piggy books. Did you ever have those in childhood? Miss Piggy's books. So Miss Piggy was wonderful, cartoon character. And Miss Piggy's diet consisted, most diets have a treat. At the end, you can eat eggs and then you must deprive yourself of all of these things, but then you can have one treat if you've been a good person, right? So Miss Piggy's guide to dieting was to take just the treats from every diet. And in a way, I mean, it sounds a little frivolous, but in a way, this is what we're trying to do, is bring, so much of this law is siloed. There are good bits in so many different parts, is trying to bring it together in a more cohesive way, and through this moratorium to actually create something that sets precedent for the global commons, not only for the Arctic, but one that can be used as a model. And more, this is how change happens. We create models that people say, yeah, now we see how this works. And the big thing, as all of you have emphasized, is that we don't have time. So we are going to have to really find a way that we can make these protections happen very fast. And we believe this is one of the pathways to do that. And we are already, and there's Vanuatu, Bahamas countries are really showing interest because they understand what the consequences are for them. Now, we don't have much time here either, but I would like to ask our panelists, having just had a first round, whether there are any particular comments. I often sit on a panel and then I think, oh, darn, I wish I'd said that. So is there a darn, I wish I'd said that moment that you'd like to add? Michael?
I'm just a little bit overwhelmed, to be honest. There's so much that could be said, but it's already been said. A lot of it's so eloquently by other people. I think everyone here would accept and embrace the notion that the Arctic is under enormous pressure, and some of that pressure is climate driven, but there are other pressures as well from various activities that are being conducted there. I do most of my work in the Antarctic, but of course there are parallels, but there are also huge differences. The Arctic, one of the major ones, of course, is the Arctic is home to hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, and they have this enormous stake in what happens there because it is where they live. So other people, such as myself, who live elsewhere in the world, we have these big interests and these big reasons for caring about the Arctic. But engaging with that, indigenous population, the local population, and finding out solutions that work for them as well as for everybody else, is so critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Heidi.
Yeah, today I'm a little bit shocked about something that happened yesterday. I don't know if you heard, but Norway has made one step closer to allow deep sea mining in their waters. And although this is not surprising, obviously it is an enormous shock because the public opinion is really shifting in Norway. They're really against
this deep sea mining. And, you know, a few weeks ago when I was in Svalbard, I saw this ship that I'd never seen before that was there to map the seafloor around the waters of Svalbard. And we know how precious these ecosystems are. So it is extremely frustrating, and we have a sense of urgency. They also have their own sense of urgency. And we need to use, I agree, every tool possible to stop these things from happening. And here, you know, we're at COP28. We know that COP is far from perfect. We also know that we need all these countries to agree on a final decision text. We heard yesterday that Saudi Arabia would absolutely never allow a phase down of fossil fuels. So that's it. That's probably it for the phase down of fossil fuels. It will probably never happen at COP28. But this is why we need to rely on these other mechanisms. This is why moratoriums are such a great way to stop these stupid activities from happening. So please, again, you know, support what we've been talking about here. It is absolutely vital. Thank you.
I completely agree. I think that, you know, when we come to COP, we have the opportunity to push back against these systems of oppression and these governments that are not listening to nature, not listening to the people, not listening to wisdom, or any sense. They're listening to economic frameworks that are killing all of us. And so it is very important that we are here, and we also get to use this opportunity to convene and share ideas and to build our movements together. And I think that's extremely valuable. And to look at these different ideas where we are really going to have to navigate around governments who are not acting at speed and scale, or from a climate justice framework. And so I think we have our work cut out for us. And, you know, just to note that yesterday, I'm sure some of you saw the news, that, you know, there's close to 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists here, which is up quite a bit from last year, like 4 times as much. And so we can't be, you know, I think we need to be very well aware of the fact of what is going on at this COP and the conflict of interest that's going on and the battle that we're really in and the struggle that we're in. And so I think it's really important that we continue to work together, as you were saying, Inga, and to, you know, realize that we need to collectively build our movement stronger and stronger and network together, because we're going to have to move in our own way outside of these institutions and outside of these governance structures, because they're not going in the right direction. It's just not feasible. We don't have the politics in place, but it doesn't mean we have to lose. It means that we need to fight harder and also outside and around the system and be very transformative. And that's what we're talking about, the moratorium, with rights of nature, with the fossil fuel treaty. We're going to have to continue to build strength in our movements and listen to Indigenous leadership, as many of us have mentioned, and really look at the kinds of structures and systems and ideas that we have that are outside of the confines of the structure.
There's not much to add to everything you guys have said, other than I think we want to underscore this importance of urgency. And I think, potentially naively, I really struggle to understand how governments and leaders and negotiators are continuing to delay on things like this and how long these processes take. I mean, I'm as old as it took to get the BBNJ across the line. And so I think if that's not an indicator of how long these things take for what seems to me like no good reason, I think we really need to underscore that urgency. And I think continuing to push for fossil fuel phase out to be in that final language, because if we wait another year, I'm not sure what that's going to look like. And getting a moratorium across the line, getting the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty across the line as soon as we can, I think underscore that the Arctic doesn't have time, and neither do we.
I think I would just add an encouragement to think about the Arctic as you're going around at your other events this week and next week. I have been struck that I think the only conversation of the Arctic or Antarctic Birthing Biosphere in general has been in this pavilion. And I've gone to other events talking about oceans, talking about, you know, global climate change, and not once has the Arctic been brought up. And it's deceptive. I mean, I was born and raised in a landlocked, about as landlocked as you can get in North America. And thought, I'm not going to be doing work on the Arctic. I'm not going to be doing work in the oceans. Like that's absolutely doesn't touch me. And as we've gotten to the work here and the science of it and how it absolutely impacts every single ecosystem on this planet because of the way it regulates, it is jaw-dropping to me how little it is part of the conversation.
Yeah, sure. No, very good point. I was at an ocean event and we were frozen to the oceans. So we need you. We need you. Please pick up these postcards. They tell the story very clearly. Be our ambassadors. And can we have the next slide up, which is QR code for global choices. Sorry. There we go. So do please sign up to be an Arctic Ice Defender. We are building an Arctic Ice Force, and it needs all of you to sign up. Get your parents, your children, your aunts, uncles, friends, just sign up to be Arctic Ice Defenders because our lives depend on it. And thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to those who are